Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, welcome back. Hopefully you have a very good holidays, you enjoy your holidays. Well, in this short session, we will focus specifically on the key principles that guide English curriculum development in Indonesian secondary schools. So we will specifically focus on English curriculum development in Indonesian secondary schools. Previously, we'll talk about how to develop a curriculum in general, but now we will focus on Indonesian secondary schools context. This presentation, everyone, is meant as a brief wrap-up, to strengthen your understanding of how curriculum principles inform real classroom practice in English teaching. So again, as a brief wrap-up, you will find similar concept or perhaps quite similar information that you or your friends have presented in your presentation. Rather than looking again at curriculum documents or models, today we focus on curriculum principles, as I stated previously. So these principles help teachers make sound decisions, interpret national policies, make interpretation, correct interpretation of national policies, and translate curriculum goals into meaningful classroom practices, especially in English teaching. So that is the basic reason, foundation, why it is important to focus on curriculum principles. We go to the first principle. The first principle is called relevance and context. So before we jump deeply into this first principle, so I'm going to talk about 4 principles here on this good occasion. Okay, there is the first principle, relevance and context. An effective English curriculum must reflect learners' real needs, and the social and cultural context in which learning takes place. Okay. For example, okay, let's check, or let's Indonesian secondary schools. In Indonesian secondary schools, English lessons can include topics such as students' daily activities, students' local culture, for example, or the students' school life, or current social issues that students are familiar with. For example, COVID-19, for example, that are still fresh in our mind, and whatever that is currently happening around the students' context. Another example is focusing on practical communication skills. For example, there is commonly found in the English classroom, such as giving directions and then expressing opinions or participating in simple discussions. So the teacher, rather than teaching program rules in isolation, so they make use of those contexts as teaching materials. So English learning becomes, meaningful when it connects to students' lives, not when it is taught as isolated grammar or vocabulary. Okay, there is principle number 1 is very important, relevance and context. We go to principle 2 out of 4 principles that I'm going to present. This second principle is called learner-centeredness. Okay, you heard this in one of your friends' presentation before. So again, this presentation or this session is meant to strengthen your understanding. Okay. This principle emphasizes that students should be active participants in learning process, not just passive receivers of information. Again, students should be active participants in the learning process, not just receive the information passively. In English classrooms, this can be seen when students are encouraged, are motivated to work in pairs or groups, or take part in role plays, for example, or practice conversations related to real situation. For example, instead of only explaining grammar rules, teachers can ask students to create short dialogues, or sharing opinions, or responding to simple questions, of course by using English. So, by paying attention to students' abilities, interest, and motivation, English learning moves beyond memorization, and becomes more engaging and meaningful. Memorization is very important, but an effective learning, an efficient learning goes beyond only memorizing something, but try to implement it for the real life. It is the third principle, is alignment and coherence. This is very important principles. This principle means that learning objectives, teaching materials, classroom activities, and assessment should support one another, So in English teaching, for example, if the curriculum goal is to develop students' speaking skills, then classroom activities should include discussion, should also include role plays, or should also include oral presentation. And assessment should also focus on speaking performance. Of course, it wouldn't be coherent to teach speaking skills, for example, but you as a teacher assess students only through multiple choice grammar test. So when alignment is strong, students clearly understand what they are learning, why they are learning it, and how their learning will be evaluated. This is the fourth principle, or the last principle that we are talking about here on this good occasion. The last principle is flexibility and adaptation. Curriculum should be seen as a guide. Okay, you already hear about this over and over again, so it is very important to emphasize this point. Curriculum should be seen as a guide, not a rigid script, right? That must be followed exactly. In real English classrooms, teachers often need to adjust lesson plans based on students' proficiency levels, classroom conditions, or available resources. Adaptation skill is very important, owned by a teacher. For example, if students struggle with a reading text, the teacher may simplify the task, provide additional vocabulary support, or use visual aids to help comprehension. Okay. Another example is adjusting the pace of lessons or modifying activities when students need more practice. So this flexibility allows teachers to respond to classroom realities while still meeting curriculum goals. Okay, that's all the four principles. So we will touch on the teacher's role in curriculum development. Okay, we already talked about this previously, but again, there is just an strengthening to strengthen your understanding. So the role of teachers in curriculum development is very important. So teachers are not just users, of the curriculum. They are curriculum developers at classroom levels. They develop curriculum again in the classroom level. For example, English teachers decide how to select or adapt teaching materials. So they match students' language levels and interest. A teacher may, modify a textbook activity, add supplementary materials, or design communicative tasks that better suit the classroom context. Teachers also make decisions about how to implement assessment, such as choosing project-based tasks, for example, or performance assessment instead of relying only on written tests. So through reflection on what works and what doesn't, teachers continuously improve both their teaching practice and the way the curriculum is implemented. Well, everyone, my great students, before we finish, I would like you to reflect on these questions. So please consider which principle you find most important for English teaching in Indonesian secondary schools and why. This reflection will help you connect curriculum theory, the theory of curriculum, with your future teaching practice as a teachers. Well, as a future or current English teachers, understanding curriculum principles allows you to teach with purpose, sensitivity, and flexibility, especially in the diverse context of Indonesian secondary schools. Thank you for your participation and thoughtful reflection. As always, I encourage you to keep these principles in mind as you continue developing your teaching practice, as a teachers. So let's continue learning, reflecting, and growing together. That's it. Inshallah, see you next time. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.